that we were starting a new year. Now here we are close to the end. And it has been a good year, and I'm so thankful for God and His goodness and what He's doing. And we're so glad that you're here with us today. Would you stand together and let's go to the Lord in word of prayer and ask God to speak to us and bless us as we worship Him today. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, we bow before you today and we tell you that we love you. Lord, we're so thankful for your goodness. And Lord, I pray that you meet with us in a special way today. Lord, what we stand in need of today is a closer walk with you. And I pray, Father, that you help us through the singing of these wonderful songs, Lord, through the preaching of your word, to draw a little closer to you today. And Lord, we just again give you all the praise and the glory for everything that's done. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, if you remain standing, you can turn in your hymn books to hymn 293. Jesus is coming again, hymn 293. And we'll sing the first and the third verse of hymn 293. Now this may be new for a few of you, but you'll do a great job and you'll get the tune up. All right?
Jesus. Children's Church. I know Becky's real excited to have each and every one of you. Then following Sunday, which will be next Sunday, the 7th, we will vote on those new bylaws. There will not be any question and answer on the 7th. It's just a vote, yes or no. So it's Wednesday evening at 6:30. I also want to point out, and I also want to thank, this past Wednesday, our youth put together the bags for Guatemala. Most of you may or may not know, but our church has been there twice. The first time we went and visited the areas that we visited, most of them lived in paper, cardboard homes. When we went back a few years later, a lot of them did at least have the cinder block home, but of course still with the dirt ground. Well, unfortunately, we've had so many things that happen around our world, from hurricanes, floods, tsunami. They also experienced a volcano eruption the same time that Hawaii was going through there. So there was not a lot in the media about it. But half of the places that we previously have visited were impacted by that. So I know that the bags that we are sending are going to have an even greater and be an even better blessing to these kids. The group, Hearts for Heavens, that's doing it, unfortunately with Samaritan Purse, not everybody gets a box through that process. So that's why we adopted Guatemala, because they were not getting them. We prepared over 100 bags. And I would specifically want to thank Judy and Nancy, who made the bags. And then I want to thank Laura Baker, Jackie, and Kathy Bradshaw, for whom, if they hadn't come and helped me on Thursday, I wouldn't have been able to get them ready for delivery on Friday. So thank you to you, because you supplied the items that we needed to fill those bags. So I'm very, very grateful. I also want to just point out that, and thank Heather. Heather's been doing some research for us on how we as a church can best support what's going on the East Coast. Now, many of you have felt led to go ahead and do something now, and I appreciate that. We want to highly recommend the North Carolina Baptist men because they're going to be there for the long haul, and their primary need is financial because they're feeding a lot of people. But through the research that Heather's been able to do, Heather was from Cleveland, you may or not be aware of. So she is very familiar with the areas that were hard hit. She has communicated with her pastor, which has 3 campuses, and they have provided us with some resources of some really needed items. And so you will see that in the next couple of weeks, and there will be options on how you can give back and serve. I also want to point out, every day on my email, I get a request from the East North Carolina Baptist men saying they need volunteers. So if it has been laid on your heart to volunteer, please use that as an avenue which you can. You don't have to worry about anything. They train you, they teach you, they provide you with all that you need as far as gloves, masks, and everything. So if you have a desire to physically go and help, then look up the North Carolina Baptist men. What they're doing now primarily is tear out, sheetrock, personal belongings, because it's all just need to be taken to the road. And lastly, I want to just make reference to I was going to call it the bone weevil, but I want to call it the music. There you go. I'm about to call it the wrong thing. We've got several of you who have volunteered. You know, it was postponed. We are actually doing a tent this year. We're really excited about it as an outreach. So I want you to also just kind of think about that. If you could come and serve for a couple of hours. And we're going to be giving out cold water, just some refreshments, just to try to socialize with people in our community about and tell them about the great things that are happening here at First Baptist Church. Thanks.
If you are a man who would like to go, or if you're a female and you'd like to go down the coast, please let myself or Susan know. We can put you in contact with the folks that are going down there to get you the right information so that you can go help. And we certainly do want to remember all those families here in our state that are struggling. Well, if you're visiting with us today, we're glad to have you with us. Hope that you'll fill out that visitor's card in the pew rack in front of you so we can have a record of your visit. And you may or may not, if you fill that out, get some homemade cookies. And so, and there's a very handsome delivery man that brings them the cookies. And there's just all kinds of added things you get when you visit First Baptist Church. So anyway, but no, if you would fill that out, and if you come back around, you're going to learn. We like to have a good time around here. And heaven's going to be a wonderful place full of songs and praises to our Lord, and we're going to be with family. So if we don't learn to enjoy each other down here, we're going to have a long time in eternity on it. And anyway, very good. Well, listen, let's stand together, and we'll sing another chorus, and we'll have a time of fellowship with one another. If you want to stand together, if you'd like to turn to your hymn book, you can. And then you can turn to page 91. And we'll not sing the verses, but we'll just sing the chorus of Surely Goodness and Mercy.
Mercy
one Sunday, and I thank all of you who gave, and we had a great offering last week. Hope that you'll do that and help us to make up for missing one Sunday. Gracie Rapp is going to come and lead us in our offertory prayer, and then I'm going to come with a message from God's Word. So if you want to turn your Bibles to 1 Peter, you can, and after Gracie prays and take up the offering, I'll come with the message. Gracie, come lead us in our prayer.
Let us pray. Dear Lord, we love you so very, very much. We just first of all want to thank you for the many blessings that you have so graciously given us, dear Lord. We thank you for not only the financial blessings that you give us, because we are rich in the eyes of everybody else in third world countries, dear Lord. We just thank you also just for the environment that we live in. We don't have to worry about volcanoes or very tremendous storms or natural disasters that come our way. We're just super thankful for that, dear Lord. And we're also thankful for the help and the family and the friends that you provide us with and that you bless us with each and every day. Dear Lord, I pray as this offering will be taken up, I pray that may we please give and give and give, and may we please give with a selfless heart, knowing that you will do miraculous things with it, dear Lord. And I just pray that not only may you use us financially, but may you use our gifts, our talents, our everyday walks. May you use our lives just to fulfill your beautiful will, dear Lord. And above all, we thank you for dying on the cross for all of our sins, because we don't deserve it, but yet you just keep pouring in the blessings, and we love you so much. I pray that may you be with us this week. May we just truly take hold of what we've learned in the next hour to come, and we put it to our lives each and every day. We love you so very much, and we thank you. In your holy, precious, amazing name, amen.
Take your Bibles this morning, if you haven't already, and go to the book of 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter number 1. We'll begin reading in just a moment from verse number 18. 1 Peter chapter number 1. First Peter chapter number 1. Find the book of 1 Peter after the book of Hebrews, the book of James, and surprisingly, just before the book of 2 Peter. Don't you like all these helpful tips that you have? You don't just get this insight anywhere. I work hard to give you that kind of 1 Peter chapter number 1. Let's begin reading this morning, verse number 18. The Bible says, "For as much as ye know that ye were not redeemed with corruptible things, as silver and gold, from your vain conversation received by traditions from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as a lamb without blemish and without spot, who verily was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you." I want to draw your attention to three words we find here in the 20th verse of 1 Peter chapter number 1. I encourage you to notate those by either underlining or drawing a circle or a square around. But it's the words, "these last times." These last times. Peter writes, "but was manifest in these last times for you." Today I want to begin a short series of messages entitled "The Time of Your Life." And as we look here in the book of 1 Peter, Peter teaches us some wonderful things about time and some very important things about time. Time is a precious thing, and it is a thing that once it is gone forever. Once time has passed, we cannot go back, no matter how much we like to. C.S. Lewis says that the present is the point at which time touches eternity. Steve Jobs says this about time. He says it's really clear that the most precious resource we all have is time. Charles Darwin makes this statement about time. He says, "A man who dares to waste 1 hour of time has not discovered the value of life." Now, as a child of God, you and I recognize that there is coming a time when the Lord Jesus will return, and when He returns, He will first return and rapture the church out, and we'll be called to heaven, and then we'll end the things that are prophesied about in the book of Revelation. There is coming a time when the Lord will return with His saints, and the world will face judgment. And at surface value, when we read this, at first we may think that that's what Peter is referring to here in verse 20, when he says the last times. But the reality is, he's not speaking about the second coming of Christ to judge the world. He's not speaking of the tribulation or the millennial reign of Christ. He's speaking about the time leading up to that. He's speaking about the time that you and I live in right now. The word time that's used here in verse 20 is the Greek word chronos, and it literally means and speaks of a season or a space of time, not a specific event in time. And so as we read what Peter tells us here, he tells us that Christ was crucified in the last times. Now, what that means is this, that God categorized the time that Jesus was crucified as the last times. Now let that soak in for a moment. God says that the time that Jesus was crucified, He looked at that as that was the last times. That was in the season of the last times. Well, we're 2,000 years plus further into time than when Jesus was crucified. So if Jesus was crucified in the season that God categorizes as the last times, then how much further into the last times are you and I? You and I are closer to the coming of Christ than we've ever been. We're closer to the coming of Christ than any human being has ever experienced in life. And because of that, Peter gives you and I some instruction about why and how we're to spend the time of our life. And so this morning, I want us to consider these last times, this season that God refers to as the last times that we're living in, and look at three things that Peter teaches us about how you and I are to live our life in these last times. If you want to take notes this morning, note first of all with me our mind in the last times. Our mind in the last times. If we go back several verses in our text, Peter begins to give us some instructions about having the right state of mind during these last times that we live in. And he gives us three specific things that I want us to consider this morning as we think about our mind in the last times. The first one is this. He speaks first of all about the preparation of our mind. The preparation of our mind. Notice what he says here in verse 13. In verse 13, Peter writes, "Wherefore gird up the loins of your minds." Now that's an odd expression to you and I. You and I wouldn't go around today and if we were on a military base or if we were getting ready to go somewhere with our family or we were getting ready to play a sport, we wouldn't say, all right, everybody gird up your loins. Well, it's because we don't dress the way that they did in that day. In that day, the common attire for a man and the common attire for women was a robe or it was a tunic. And it would hang down long, down near your ankles. And so when they would get ready to go and travel, or they would get ready to work, or if they were soldiers getting ready for battle, they would have to take and do what they call gird up your loins. They'd have to do something with all this excess cloth around their knees because it's not easy to move around in a long skirt, is it, ladies? Can I have an amen? Amen. And it's binding to your legs. And so they would do what is called gird up your loins. Now you say, Pastor, if I am ever wearing a tunic, how do I gird up your loins? I'm so glad you asked me because I've got a chart to show you how to gird up your loins. You can see in the top left-hand corner, we have Fred. And Fred is wearing a tunic. And Fred needs to gird up his loins. So the first thing he does in image 2 is he hikes up his garment. The image 3, he pulls it all to the front. Image 4, he tucks it between his legs. And then image 5, he grabs the excess cloth. In image 6, he tucks it and grabs his sword and he's ready for battle. So when Peter says gird up your loins, this is what was common practice in that day. They understood exactly what he was trying to say. But he doesn't just say gird up your loins. In verse 13, he says gird up the loins of your mind. What Peter is trying to tell them is he says that because you're living in these last times, you need to have your mind in preparation. You need to be mentally prepared to move. You need to be mentally prepared for spiritual things. You need to stay ready. You need to stay ready for the battle. You need to stay ready to advance and to progress spiritually as we're living in these last times. Just as a soldier or a person would gird up their regular loins to move, he says we need to gird up the loins of our mind so that we can be ready to proceed. Well, that's the first lesson he teaches about our minds. But notice the second thing. The second thing he tells us is not only the preparation of our mind, but secondly, the precision of our mind. Secondly, he speaks about the precision of our mind. Notice again in verse 13. First of all, he says, wherefore gird up the loins of your mind. But then he uses two words to express the next step. He says, be sober. Be sober. Secondly, he says that we need to have our minds in sobriety. He's saying literally that we need to be mentally focused and serious about spiritual matters in our time. I'm going to be quite honest with you. I fear that there's many of God's people today that are mentally inebriated with other things in their mind that are distracting them and causing their mind to be fuzzy and not focused on the truths and not focused on living for Christ. We get focused on too many other things in this world, and if we're not careful, we fall asleep spiritually. And Peter tells us, he says, listen, you're living in the last times. When Christ was crucified, God categorized that as the last time. And now, 2,000 years later, you're that much further into the last times. He says, listen, you need to gird up your minds and be prepared, but you also need to make sure that you're mentally precise in the way that you're viewing spiritual matters. Sometimes I'm afraid that the church today, all across this nation, I'm afraid that we've become like the Navy at Pearl Harbor. We've got all the tools and all the assets that we could ever need to win the battle and defeat any army, any other navy, any other enemy that may come about us. But if we're not careful, just like those ships were caught off guard, we're going to be caught asleep. And we're going to end up being destroyed. And we're going to lose all the freedoms that have been so dearly bought through our forefathers. Peter says our mind, we need to have our minds prepared. We need to have our minds precise. But thirdly, he speaks about the perspective of our minds. The third thing he speaks about in verse 13 is the perspective of our minds. He says, wherefore gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and hope to the end for the grace that is to be brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. The third thing he speaks about is our perspective. You know, if we're not careful, all we listen to is the nasty news. And we listen to this bad thing that happened and that bad thing that happened. And breaking news, something else bad happened. And if we're not careful, We get our eyes so focused on the negative. We get our eyes so focused on what's not going right in the world that we can become defeated. And we become hopeless. We become despondent. We become full of despair. And what Peter says is, listen, don't forget as a believer that you have hope because Jesus Christ is still seated at the right hand of the throne of God. He is still Lord of Lords and King of Kings. He is still ruling and reigning. We have hope as believers. And if we're going to serve God in these last times, we not only need to have our minds prepared, we not only need to have our minds precise, but we also need to have the right perspective on life, and we need to portray hope to others. Sometimes I wonder if the world looks at Christianity and individual Christians and thinks, why in the world would I want something that makes me as miserable as that? Because we get that way, don't we? But the reality is, we of everyone in all the world have the most reason to have a smile on our face because we have a home in heaven. We have a reason for hope because we've been saved, we've been washed by the precious blood of the Lamb, and we don't have no hope. We've got a great, glorious hope, and His name is Jesus Christ. So Peter first speaks about the perspective, or he first speaks about our mind in these last times. But then he goes on and speaks about a second thing. Secondly, he speaks about our mannerisms in the last times. Secondly, he speaks about our mannerisms. First, he says we need to have our mind right. But now he moves on and he says there's some other things that you need to have right. You need to have the right behavior in the last times. And he gives us two things that I want to point out. The first thing he gives us is a caution about our conformity. The first thing he gives us as he addresses our mannerisms is a caution about our conformity. Now notice verse number 14. Verse number 14, Peter continues to write. He's just told us about our mind. Verse 14, he says this, as obedient children, not fashioning yourselves according to the former lusts in your ignorance. Now you say, Pastor, what in the world does that mean? Well, notice the expression, he says, not fashioning yourselves. Not fashioning yourselves is actually one Greek word. And it's a Greek word that basically ties in and means to pattern or to conform. So in essence, what he's saying is just like if you were in a clothes manufacturing store or you were a warehouse and they cut out a pattern for a shirt or they cut out a pattern for a dress. There's a pattern. And every one of the dresses that's going to be made like that is made just like that pattern. You understand? It's an assembly line. And what Peter says is this. He says, I want to caution you about who you're patterning or fashioning yourself after. He says, do not fashion yourselves according to the former lusts in your ignorance. He says, don't live your life today the same way that you lived it before you met Christ. He said, as a Christian, there needs to be a difference. There's a change that happens in your life. And in essence, he's saying, don't conform and try to be exactly like the world because as a Christian, you're different. And you're portraying a completely different message. And truth be told, he goes right along with what Paul told the church in Romans chapter 8, verse 29. In chapter 8, verse 29, Paul wrote to the church in Rome and he says that we're to be conformed to the image of Christ. In essence, we're to be being more and more like Christ. Our desire is to follow His pattern, not the pattern of somebody else. And so he gives us a caution about our conformity. But then he goes on and continues his conversation by giving us a command about our conversation. Secondly, he gives us a command about our conversation. Now, conversation is just an old English word that talks about our life. But notice what he says here in verse 15. He says, but as he which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation, or all manner of your life. He's building on what he's telling them. He says, in the last times, you need your mind right. But you also need to have the right mannerisms. And in the last times, he says, you don't need to be conforming to the world. You don't need to look and talk and act and behave just like the world. You need to be looking and acting and talking and behaving more like Jesus Christ. And he says, not only that, he says, but as you do that, he says, the way you do that is to be holy. Now, the word holy that he uses here in verse 15 is the Greek word hagios. And it literally means to be pure or to be morally blameless. To be like Christ means that we live a pure life. We live a life that is blameless of immorality. And we don't hear much preaching about holiness today. You can turn on a televangelist, you won't hear them talking about holiness. You can visit a lot of churches in our area or across the state or across the country, and there's not much preaching on holiness today. And the result is this, that our churches and Christianity and society has a growing lack of holiness. When Peter clearly tells us to be ye holy, because God is holy. We need a revival of holiness in our nation today. But as we think about these last times, this season we're in, he gives us some instruction first. He says, you need to make sure you have your mind right in these last times. Then he says we need to make sure we have our mannerisms right in these last times. But notice the third and final thing. The third and final thing he tells us is our motivation in the last times. Our motivation in the last times. You say, Pastor, why should I make sure that my mind and my mannerisms are right in these last times? Why is it that I should just do what I want, when I want, how I want, whatever I want, to whoever I want? Why is it that you and I'm asking you sincerely, think about it, why is it that you and I should come to church on Sunday morning? Why is it that you and I should come and sit in a Sunday school class or a small group and learn and talk about the truths of God? Why is it that we should spend time daily in our devotions and daily praying and seeking God? Why is it that we should do any of that? Well, he tells us here in these verses. And he gives us two reasons. The first one is because of the price of our redemption. The first motivation for living for God and having the right mind and the right mannerisms is because of the price of our redemption. Notice what he says here in verses 18 and 19. Verse 18, he says, for as much as ye know that ye were not redeemed with corruptible things as silver and gold from your vain conversation received by the tradition of your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. Notice in verse 18 he says, for as much as ye know. He says this isn't something that you don't know, but quite honestly it's something that many of us forget at times. Sometimes if we're not careful, we get into a rut of trying to attend church and to serve God to please other people or to try to please the pastor. Listen, don't come to church because you're trying to please me. Have a far greater motivation than that. Don't come to church because you're trying to please your mama, you're trying to please your grandma, you're trying to please somebody else. There's a higher motivation to serve God. And what Peter says is this. He says the motivation that we need is to recognize the price of our redemption. He tells us in verse 18, he says, for as much as you know that you were not redeemed with corruptible things as silver and gold. He says, you're not saved, you don't have a home in heaven because you bought your way there. You don't have a home in heaven because you've got less or because you've got more than somebody else. It's not something that you earned. And then he goes on and he says, from your vain conversation received by the tradition from your fathers. He's speaking about religious tradition. He says, you're not going to heaven because you attend church. You're not going to heaven, you don't have a home in heaven because you obeyed and kept all these traditions of men. But in verse 19 he says, but with the precious blood of Christ as a lamb without blemish and without spot. He says the reason that you and I have hope, the reason that you and I have a home in heaven is because of Jesus Christ. And that is the only reason. His suffering and sacrifice was the price and his death was the price. You and I should live for Christ because we remember the great price of our redemption. Not only do we remember and motivated by the price of our redemption, secondly, we're motivated by the passion of our Redeemer. We should be motivated by the passion of our Redeemer. Notice what the Bible says in verse 20. He says, who verily was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for who? For you. For you. You say, what was the passion of our Redeemer? It was you. It was me. You say, oh, Pastor, I know Jesus died for the sins of the world, but what does that do for me? What it does for you is you need to understand that he died for you. And if it had only been you, if it had only been me, he would have still gone to the cross. He died for you. It wasn't his crimes. It wasn't his sins. It wasn't his faults. It was mine. It was yours. It was the mistakes that you and I have made. It was the failures that you and I have had that caused him to go to that tree so that you and I could hunting together. We had a firearm, and we were out with all the best intentions in the world, and we saw a bush shake, and we thought it was the animal that we were hunting, and I took and handed you the rifle and said, there it is. There's what we've been after. Shoot. And you took the shot. But when we got up there, it wasn't the animal, it was another person. And you'd committed murder. Well, now we've got a real problem on our hands. You just committed murder. But when the police officers come, I take the gun. And I say, it wasn't you, it was me. I pulled the trigger. I made a mistake. And when we went to the courtroom, the jury didn't indict you, they indicted me. And when we went and the execution was performed, it wasn't you, but it was me. Would you not be awfully motivated to do anything that I asked you to do because of all that I had done for you? You see, that's what Christ did. Except it wasn't a murder. It was every wrong thing that you and I have ever done from the time we were born to the time that we died. He took it all. And he said, no, I don't want you to be judged for that. I'll pay the judgment so that you can go free. You see, beloved, these are the last times. And we have a responsibility to live for the Christ who saved us, who paid for our freedom with his precious blood on the cross. That's why we should have our mind right. That's why we should have our mannerisms right. Not to try to please some religious group, not to appease our mind, but to please the one to whom we all owe everything. That's the Lord Jesus Christ. What more motivation do we need than the love and sacrifice of Christ and to give our life to Him? Peter says Jesus was crucified in these last times. Here we are, 2,000 years further into the season that God calls the last times. And may God help us to have our mind right and our mannerisms right. All because we're motivated because of what Jesus Christ has done for us. Let's bow our heads in prayer. As they come and begin to softly play, our heads are bowed, our eyes are closed. Jesus Christ did pay for our redemption with his precious blood. He has purchased our salvation. But just as a regular gift that you may purchase for someone or that I may purchase for someone, just because we purchased it doesn't mean that that person has it. They have to reach out and receive it and accept it. Christ died on the cross, was buried, and rose again the third day so that you could have a home in heaven. But if you've never asked him to forgive your sins and you put your trust and faith in him, then right now heaven's not your home. But it can be. If you're here today and you've never asked Jesus Christ to forgive your sins and trusted him as Savior, in just a moment when we begin our invitation, I'd invite you to come. Let me take a Bible and show you how you do this. Maybe you're here today and you say, Pastor, I know that I'm saved. I know that I've been redeemed. But God, by his Spirit, has touched my heart today that my mind, it's not prepared the way that it needs to be. I'm not girding up the loins of my mind. I'm not as precise as I need to be. My mind is honestly focused on other things so much of the time, and I don't give as much consideration to the things of God as I need to. Or maybe you're here today and you've lost the joy of your salvation. You know that happened to David. You know what David did? David prayed and he said, Lord, restore unto me the joy of my salvation. God doesn't want us to go through this life miserable because we're a Christian. He wants us to have joy and hope. Or maybe it's your mannerisms. Maybe you've fallen into some bad habits trying to conform back to some old ways and some old things. Whatever it is that God by his Spirit has touched your heart on today, if you need to come and pray, this altar's open. Heavenly Father, pray you have your will and way through this invitation. Jesus, as she continues to play, if you need to come, this altar is open.